Today I'll be taking a look at another gaming monitor that recently hit the market, the Aorus FI32Q from Gigabyte. It is a 32-inch Quad HD monitor with an IPS panel and 170Hz refresh rate, and it has a display HDR 400 label. Now, it is definitely not a budget monitor, as you will have to spend $750 ex taxes in the US or around 800 euros with taxes here in the Netherlands. But that price is also kinda in line with what you would usually have to spend on a high-end 27-inch IPS gaming monitor, and it is also in line with some other 32-inch IPS monitors that are just coming out, like the Asus ROG PG329Q, for example. So the price is not that unreasonable, assuming it is a good monitor. So let's check it out. This video is brought to you by Seasonic and their Prime Series power supplies. These top quality power supplies are very efficient, they're whisper quiet, extremely reliable, and my go-to choice for most of my test rigs and builds around here. And to make the deal even sweeter, Seasonic wraps it all up in a cozy 12-year-long warranty. Check them out using the links in the description below. If we look at the build quality of this monitor, Gigabyte is off to a really good start. It has a solid metal stand that is exceptionally sturdy, and it holds this large panel without much of that annoying wobble. It can easily compete with a high-end ROG models, and it is actually way better than the stand on my more expensive 38-inch LG ultra-wide. It just looks and feels really well built. Ergonomics are great too. It is height adjustable, you can tilt it, swivel it around its axis, rotate it 90 degrees, and if you prefer, you can even base mount it as well. Even though it is a very subjective thing, I actually do like the design of this monitor. It has a fairly clean front, it is flat, which I think it makes sense for a 16:9 panel of this size, and on the back it has a more gamey design with some lines and a bit of RGB, but in a typical setup with your monitor against a wall, you won't see that anyway. Now, when it comes to connections, it has one DisplayPort 1.4 connection, two HDMI 2.0 ports, USB Type-C port, a USB hub, and audio connections. There is no HDMI 2.1, but that is also kinda not needed here. OSD is controlled with a little joystick under the monitor, which works pretty well. If I had to nitpick, I would say that they could improve the speed of the OSD controls, as it does feel a bit slower compared to some competitors, but it is not that bad and it is very easy to get used to. Now, you can also control the entire OSD via the software using your mouse instead. The OSD itself comes with the usual gaming focus features like contrast enhancers, crosshairs, timers, overdrive controls, and of course, a bunch of color presets. It is a little bit odd that the factory default setting is the low brightness green mode instead of the standard mode, but at least they did include a proper sRGB mode with control over brightness. Now, Gigabyte is really trying to add a long list of features to their Aorus products, and while some of them are really worth talking about, others just aren't. Like the active noise cancelling feature, for example, to remove background noise from your microphone. Now, they've been pushing this one since their very first gaming monitor, and I still kind of struggle to see an actual use for it. They might as well just skip it and make the monitor a tad cheaper, in my opinion. But there are also a lot of features that are actually quite useful. So they included a KVM switch, so you can control two devices using one keyboard and a mouse, as long as the second device has a Type-C connection with a DisplayPort Alt Mode support, like most recent high-end laptops do. Now, another one is a pretty decent DAC inside of the monitor itself. This doesn't improve the sound coming out of the monitor because this monitor doesn't have any speakers, but it does mean that it can provide a good quality sound to an analog headset if you connect it directly to the back of this monitor. So, if you have a PC that has a poor audio chip, this might help a lot. It also includes aim stabilizer sync, which is a type of backlight strobing, and it works with G-Sync and Freesync enabled. But what is it like to actually use this monitor? The first thing I need to point out is probably the size. A 32-inch monitor isn't exactly small, and it is something you need to get used to if you're coming from a typical 27-inch monitor. With a pixel density of 93 pixels per inch, It is not as sharp as a Quad HD 27-inch monitor, but it is definitely sharp enough for gaming, and I dare to say that it is completely fine for content creation as well. Now, the upside of this resolution is that you don't need to have the latest and greatest GPU to drive games on it like you would for 4K resolution monitors. The large size makes it great for immersion-style games, but it is too big if you aim to be a serious professional esports gamer, as you will need to move your eyes around a lot to just be able to catch everything that's going on the screen. And even though I always get a bunch of comments how people are playing on their 55-inch TVs on their desk just fine, the reality is that you will lose a competitive edge because of its size, and you should probably get something smaller. Now, 32-inch monitors have a nice all-around size for gamers who play all kinds of games, as long as your desk has enough space for it. Even though it's not ideal for professional esports players, it did turn out to be very, very fast. Compared to the Asus ROG PG259QNR, which is a 360Hz 1080p IPS monitor, the average latency of the FI32Q was only around 1.5 milliseconds behind it. And that is in the default overdrive mode, which doesn't have any noticeable overshoot. And I have to say that for a larger monitor like this one that isn't trying to be the very fastest, this is a very, very good result. Now, you can go to the faster overdrive mode to make it a tiny bit faster, but that causes a really terrible amount of overshoot. And there is also a smart overdrive mode, which mostly just seems to switch between the default OD setting and the fastest one, meaning that you just occasionally have some uncomfortable overshoot. So, in my opinion, I would just ignore both of those settings and leave it in the default overdrive setting that is already quite fast and just offers the most balanced experience. Now, the motion clarity is in line with recent high-end fast 27-inch alternatives with not any visible ghosting, so it is a great monitor for faster moving games as well. Now, very important for gamers is that it seems to support variable refresh rate for both NVIDIA and AMD GPUs. Now, Gigabyte is claiming adaptive sync support, but isn't really mentioning G-Sync compatibility at all. But I was testing this monitor with NVIDIA GPUs, and it looks to be completely G-Sync compatible with no issues at all in quite a few games I tested so far, so that is really nice to point out. And as I said before, it has the aim stabilizer sync mode, making it the first Gigabyte monitor to allow backlight strobing while keeping the VRR active. Now, I have to say that I'm personally not a huge fan of backlight strobing at all, but I know some of you are. Now, my personal issue is that it usually doesn't add much at the end of the day. Many monitors don't even do it right, and others just really limit the number of situations where it's actually useful, and that's sort of the case here too. So the maximum brightness in that mode is limited to just under 180 nits, which means that even though it technically seems to be working all right as long as you're playing high FPS games, the image just isn't bright enough to be able to use it during the day or even in a remotely lit room. So if you're considering this monitor for other reasons and you just want to experiment with this mode, that's completely fine, but I wouldn't buy it just for this feature alone. In terms of image quality, the FI32Q does a pretty good job overall. It goes bright enough to up to 383 nits, and it is dimmable enough with a minimum white level of 67 nits. Contrast is just what you would expect from an IPS panel without local dimming, at just over 1000 to 1, and factory calibration is pretty decent, showing some oversaturation in most directions, which makes colors pop up a bit more, but subjectively it's quite nice to look at. Since they did include an actual sRGB mode that is accurate enough for most creators, I'm just not going to hold it against Gigabyte to oversaturate the default mode a little bit. You can just use the sRGB one if you need to. Viewing angles are excellent, as you would expect. Backlight bleed seems to be almost non-existent, and uniformity is completely fine, at least on my sample right here. So overall, it is a very pleasant image, as you should expect from a higher-end IPS monitor, and that is definitely something that I would personally pick over the cheaper VA alternatives. Now, even though you shouldn't expect an incredible HDR performance from an IPS gaming monitor without proper local dimming, the FI32Q does include an HDR 400 label and actually shows a pretty respectable 538 nit peak brightness in the HDR mode, making HDR content definitely light up a bit more than in the SDR mode. Again, this is not going to be a proper HDR experience. For that, you will have to go for an OLED panel or a monitor of a completely different caliber. So even though it might benefit some games, do not buy this monitor just for its HDR support. And I think that's all I wanted to talk about today. Now, I personally tend to prefer IPS panels over VA alternatives, and I'm really happy we are finally seeing some larger than 27-inch 16:9 fast IPS panels on the market. Now, 27-inch is still the sweet spot for many, but I can really see the appeal of having a larger monitor, especially if you're more into those story-driven games. But the main issue I'm seeing here is the fact that very good, fast 27-inch IPS monitors are becoming cheaper and cheaper. And if you go for this one, you will be paying a large chunk of that price premium just for the size alone. Now, I can't say how this Aorus will compare to its direct competitor, the Asus PG329Q, that uses an AU Optronics panel instead of the Innolux panel in this monitor, but I do think that this FI32Q does a really good job overall, performing well both in terms of speed and in overall image quality, and it is just such a nice monitor to use for gaming as well as other daily tasks. Now, that's it from me for today. I really hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe to Tech Testers to never miss an upload. Bye guys!